That is recording, yes. Hello, greetings everyone. Thank you very much for coming. Very popular one tonight, 54 people in the house. We have Dr. Andrew Boswell, who is going to enlighten us and entertain and share wisdom about the current situation with carbon capture and storage, which we know the government recently allocated billions of pounds to some big fossil fuel companies to push this forward. But obviously there's a lot of quite a controversial thing within our movements, and Andrew's an expert in these areas, and he's going to share with us. So without too much further ado, over to you, Andrew. Thank you very much for coming. Tell us about your,
thank you, Phoenix, and to your wider community hosting these webinars. I'm really pleased to be here tonight. And it's really nice looking around the room. Actually, so many people I know as well have joined this meeting. There's lots of people I don't know, but lots of people I do know. Really nice to see everybody. So I think we first titled this as taking the government to court on carbon capture. But I think the probably the more interesting part is the growing campaign against CCUS. And as we were just saying, this is now a very popular or unpopular topic, depending how you look at it, because the Labour government have adopted the Tory government's CCUS policy basically completely untouched and are sort of rolling ahead with it. So there's now a really strong campaign growing to stop that. So I'm going to talk first of all sort of what is carbon capture, and introduce some of the acronyms you may come across. It's a complex, confusing area. So that's why I'm doing that. And then the UK plans for CCUS. And I will talk about the Net Zero Teesside legal case, and that's the legal case I've had running since now about April this year. And then the growing campaign on CCS, and then where do we go, and resources and discussion. So I hope to get through that in about the 30-40 minutes. So carbon capture and storage, often referred to as CCS, carbon capture and storage, basically means capturing CO2 from usually from burning something. So you might be burning fossil fuels, or you might be processing fossil fuels, in fact, in the case of blue hydrogen, or you might be burning wood, like in the case of Drax, or some industrial process like cement and steel. And this immediately actually is where one of the problems comes in, that the people who advocate CCS would like to clump everything together as one thing without any distinction. But actually there's lots of different types of CCS, and we need to bear that in mind. You also hear carbon capture usage and storage, and traditionally that meant one of the main applications of carbon capture, actually, it's been around for about 50 years. One of the main applications historically has been extracting CO2 out of sort of streams of gas when they mine or extract oil and gas, and then basically putting that CO2 back down to pump out more oil and gas. It's called enhanced oil recovery, EOR, and the usage bit comes from that. But now usage is sort of expanding out to mean these sort of industrial clusters, and also things like actually, putting CO2 into fizzy drinks and things like that. Another one you'll come across, and very important for the UK, and I know there's on this call, there's several campaigners on Drax actually, is BECCS, which is bioenergy carbon capture and storage. And of course, that's what Drax are proposing to do with their huge, awful carbon emitting, very destructive site in Yorkshire. So who wants CCS? Well, largely it's the fossil fuel industry and governments who are captured by the fossil fuel industry. It really seems as simple as that in some ways. And why is it not a good thing? Well, it enables the fossil fuel industry to keep extracting and using fossil fuels. And of course, this is just at the time where all the impetus of things like the COP should be to get people out of fossil fuels. We see that's not actually what's happening at the COP, or the COPs in recent years. Um, but just at that time, we need to cut down fossil fuels, actually really reduce that industry, stop it altogether. This enables it to keep going basically indefinitely. Um, and so it's allowing policymakers to avoid making genuine deep emission cuts, what we might call real emission cuts, leading to real zero as opposed to net zero. Um, what we find is that the climate impacts are not properly assessed, um, in either the policy, um, or things like the environmental impact assessments which go forward for planning, which I'll talk about because that's the area I've really sort of focused on. As I said at the beginning, it is a nuanced debate, and that there is an argument perhaps that there might be some case for cement being decarbonised, for example. Possibly for steel, but the case for that is getting less and less with electric arc steel coming online now. But the problem is that the CCS is not promoted in a nuanced way. It's basically these CCUS clusters I'll come into in a minute, which basically is all or nothing. You get fossil fuel CCS, and you might possibly get some of those applications which could be helpful, but you can't separate them. So there's much misinformation, out of date, and false data. Just as an example, going the wrong way. Just as an example of misleading information, I recently saw this on the BBC website. I mean, this was just a couple of weeks ago, describing what carbon capture and storage is. Basically, it's saying, well, you've got, I hope you can see the big red cursor here, but basically it's saying you've got natural gas under the ground here, under the sea, presumably the North Sea. You extract it up straight into a power station. You assume it's burnt and 100% cleanly, so you get all the carbon dioxide separated from the other gases, and then that carbon dioxide is just pumped back down into a storage cavern neatly there. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. So, I just show that at how the mainstream media is just also taking all the simplicity, the simple arguments, which are basically wrong about CCS, and promoting them. Why it's not a good thing, another way of looking at it, and this actually is just the title or something which comes out of a report from IEFA, Carbon Capture and Storage, Europe's Climate Gamble. Too complex. Well, what we've just seen in that BBC graphic was, a very simple version of carbon capture and storage, very idealized. But what you've got to realize with that is you've got to add um, a whole new technology, carbon capture, onto an existing gas power station, onto a new one if you build it from scratch. But it's still hugely complicated. You've got to build CO2 pipelines, you've got to have CO2 compressors, you've got to have all the right geology and everything. It's a very, very complex process. And to get it right takes a long time. Nobody has ever actually really got it right. Um, and it's very, very expensive. Trillions and trillions of money could go into this literally worldwide, and it wouldn't actually help us get towards the climate targets we need to. And in fact, now it's too late to support net zero targets. At one time, maybe 20 or 30 years ago, there might have been some CCUS on fossil fuels, which might have helped transition to renewables. But now renewables are so cheap, and so implementable, it's just a matter of will, that there really isn't a case for that transition argument. I'll talk a bit about that later on. So too complex, too expensive, and too late. So what are the plans for CCUS in the UK? Well, this was the £22 billion announcement on October the 4th. We were sort of expecting this to come, and I'll come on to how we actually, a number of scientists wrote to the government to try to put them off doing this, but they went ahead. We said they should review CCS, review the science and pause. But essentially, what Starmer and Miliband and Reeves did in that announcement was that they basically just took the Tory policy. The Tories actually had 20 billion for CCS, but they hadn't actually put any of the money in a budget. But they said they were going to put 20 billion in. The Tories have just taken that, really without any change of the policy or anything. All the documents used are the old Tory documents. And later on at the October budget, I think it's October 30th, then we got 3.9 billion for the financial year 2025-2026. So what it appears is that there may not be any money actually invested till after April 2025. And I'll come on also later to the sort of the financial investment and subsidies and everything, because that's quite important. That money, the first 3.9 billion, seems to be going into next financial year. It's all based around this cluster model, which I described slightly earlier, that you basically start in each of these clusters, you start with something based on fossil fuels. And that, in a way, is the sort of thing which ratchets up the rest of the cluster. And then, if you're lucky, sort of some years downstream, you might get some decarbonisation of concrete or of a concrete factory or something. But what we're seeing with the clusters and what's actually going forward for the funding is that they're all based actually around the fossil fuels largely, and there's only a small amount of this sort of retrofitting industrial sites. So the track one clusters, which I think, but it's actually quite difficult to know where the money's going. I think that the track one clusters are where this 3.9 billion are going. And they're based around one called HyNet in the northwest. I'll show a map in the middle in a minute. And Net Zero Teesside based in the northeast. Then there's a track two, which is Acorn in Scotland, and that includes the Peterhead one. There's been a lot of controversy around that. Talk about in a minute as well. And Viking in Humberside. So if we pull the map up, you've got, that's HyNet. It's basically the Liverpool area in the northwest. I'll show more detailed maps in a moment as well. You've got in the northeast, you've got Net Zero Teesside, and Net Zero Teesside slightly confusingly applies to the whole cluster, but also the power station at the centre of it, which is the thing I'm legally challenging. Then you've got Peterhead and Acorn in Scotland in track two. And then you've got Viking and the Humberside, and that might bring in CCS from Drax and so on into a Viking field there. But there's other ones being talked about as well beyond that. For example, something at Bacton in Norfolk, where close to where I live, in fact. And there has been talk of one of the Fawley oil refinery down near the Isle of Wight and Southampton, but that seems to have gone away for the moment, that one. The Exxon who are behind that have appeared to have pulled out. So just looking at the map for HyNet to get an idea. Sorry, the writing's a bit small on this, but this is how it is on their website. But the main site is actually at Stanlow, on the Stanlow oil refinery, where that blue blob is. You can see that immediately underneath that, it's got low carbon hydrogen production. And that's basically a large blue hydrogen plant. Some of it we think is just going into Stanlow oil refinery, the first phase, just to provide hydrogen for the oil refining. But after that, then they've got a network, and where it's a solid line, that is a network of the initial phase of hydrogen pipeline. Where it's a dashed line, you see it going out further, for example, into Liverpool here and out towards Manchester. but there's only really a small amount of infrastructure connected to it in this first phase. But you've also got the CO2 pipeline, which goes out here and then sort of along the north East Wales coast, out into CO2 storage underneath Liverpool Bay. So that's the HyNet one. And HyNet is being promoted by Esau, which is an Indian-owned company, and Eni, which is an Italian-owned company. Then we have the East Coast cluster, and that contains both Teesside, which is over on the left here, but is actually sort of the north. The map's the sort of wrong way round. That's Teesside and also Humberside, and both of those might go out to this Northern Endurance Partnership, with the CO2 going down into caverns here under the North Sea, and further sort of ones possibly out there. And also, as I said, with the Humberside, there's also a Viking one. This is actually the net blowing in on the net zero Teesside one. And what you've got here is a map of all the sort of industrial stuff here, but a lot of it's not actually connected to the cluster. And this red one this is the one I'm actually legally challenging. This is a BP Equinor gas-powered fire station, which would have CCS, and basically which would also provide the pipeline out into the North Sea and all the infrastructure for that. Then you get this green line is dashed, sort of future CO2 pipeline, but actually all that's in the next phase is basically H2 Teesside, which is a blue hydrogen plant, and that's BP. And that's one I'm in planning examination of at the moment. That's basically following on. And the only other thing in the initial funding is because it's a British Oxygen Teesside hydrogen site there, is to put a small amount of carbon capture on that. So it's basically all hydrogen and gas and fossil fuels, and in that initial tranche of money, there isn't any industrial carbonisation in there. Just admit someone. And the orange block there is where they're planning to expand the existing LNG facilities and have further gasification, basically taking the LNG off the ships and putting it into the national grid. But obviously some of it sort of goes straight from over the national grid into these sites. And LNG, which is liquefied natural gas, is very important in all these arguments on CCS, as I'll come on into a minute. It's one of the acronyms to remember. LNG is liquefied natural gas. It's gas coming in from places like Qatar or Texas. So these were the claims made by Labour in the announcement of these CCS clusters and the £22 billion for it, that it would be national renewal. It would bring a new generation of jobs to industrial heartlands. It would attract 8 billion in private investment, directly create 4,000 jobs, supporting 50,000 in the long run. As with all this stuff, there's huge job wash going on. A lot of these jobs are just in the construction, and then when the sites are actually running, the jobs are much less. And there's a very, very big issue here about energy justice and just transition, moving fossil fuel jobs into renewables, and it's just not being addressed by these sort of policies. And then the claim it's going to remove 8 million tons of carbon emissions each year, and I'll come on to why that's wrong in a moment. So I've already made this point that issues at the top level, most of the track one clusters is just for fossil fuel infrastructure. There's a bit of industrial decarbonisation stuff, but on the high net one, but largely it's gas-fired power stations, blue hydrogen plants, and the like. So it's basically fossil fuel stuff, what the fossil fuel industry want. The other key issue I'd say is that climate impacts have been severely underestimated. And they're underestimated in three ways, main ways. I'll talk about these in more detail. Um, Emissions from outages and maintenance. These are sometimes not included. For example, they weren't included on the Peterhead planning application. Now, this is where they have to turn off the carbon compressor, the carbon dioxide compressor, which is the start of the pipeline, and or perhaps they have to maintain actually the carbon capture plant itself. All those things sometimes have to be turned off and maintenance, or there may be some problem. And those outages at times, so they basically just vent the CO2 to the atmosphere anyway. And that CO2 venting is not always included. Um, then the upstream emissions are not accounted for correctly. Now, this is the really, really important one as far as the carbon accounting. And this comes from the emissions which are linked to the basically the fuel supply. And if the fuel supply are for blue hydrogen or for gas and CCS um, is coming from LNG, liquefied natural gas, where it's being imported from places like Texas, where they may be fracking it in the first place, or places like Qatar, there's huge emission costs with methane losses through all the processes, extracting, during the compressing of the gas, and during the regasification of it when it's arrives in Teesside or whatever. Um, and also the CO2, there's CO2 emissions involved as well from the energy of the shipping and so on. In some cases, there's very high shipping carbon emissions involved. All of those upstream emissions are often not being accounted, and where they are being accounted, they're being underestimated. Very significant underestimated. And the third one is the carbon capture rate is overestimated. They're talking of 90 or 95% carbon capture rate. And we'll see in a minute that that's never been achieved anywhere in the world. There's the jobs point, energy justice and just transition, which we talked about earlier. Really, really important. It's not my area of expertise. And also recently, last week, the government, not the government, sorry, the NESO, which is the National Energy, I think, Supplier Organization, it's basically sort of it is National Grid and so on, a government-owned company, published a report, UK Clean Power, and they actually had a scenario in without CCS in it, or with very little CCS by 2030. So that was really interesting. I'm going to say a bit more about that later on. So I want to sort of go through very quickly the Net Zero Teesside and the Court of Appeal case. First of all, just the history of what happened. This sort of stuff is very long work. I've been involved in this now for about 3 years. I was sort of looking at it before it came onto the planning application, and then it went to a planning examination between May and November 2022. And that was a 6-month examination where I went to some of the hearings remotely and also put in submissions, and had a lot of arguments with BP and Equinor at the planning examination. And then that went on in the post-examination consultations. Basically, the government were sort of a bit worried about well, quite a few issues, but including the carbon emissions. They put out various consultations, and I was also able to get involved in those. And that's actually where some of the really interesting work was done. And then it came to a planning decision with the previous Tory Energy Minister, Claire Coutinho, February 24, um, and she passed it. And it was in March I launched the judicial review. Now I'll go into the reasons why I launched it in a minute. Um, but this was us. Actually, at least a couple of people, including myself, are on this call tonight. I noticed this was us outside the um, High Court on July the 23rd, when the High Court hearing was. And then there was a very rushed judgment. I haven't really got time to say too much about why it's judged, but it was because they wanted to make the investment decision very quickly, and the judge agreed to rush the judgment. So we got a rushed judgment in August, and then I launched the appeal. Then what sort of slightly interesting was that BP Equinor made very strong cases to the court to rush the Court of Appeal hearing as well. I mean, at one time I thought it was going to be heard at the end of September, that they were pushing it because there was a date of September the 24th to make the first investment decision. Then suddenly, from high up in the court system, they eventually came back saying, well, no, this one's going to be heard on March 4th, 5th, 2025. So somewhere along the line, they decided they weren't going to just roll over to this huge pressure to expedite the case. Very interesting. I don't fully know why. So this is the sort of issues which came up at in the planning examination and in those consultations. The first was that they were claiming that the Net Zero Teesside power would um, capture 90% of the emissions. But what you can see from this chart, which is prepared by IEFA this year, of all known systems, nothing has achieved above 78%. That one in the middle is actually a blue hydrogen site in Canada, which doesn't always reach 78%, but it has reached it in some years. That's the highest ever capture rate basically known. Yet the developers are claiming 90 to 95%. And in fact, if you look over here, natural gas fired, which is what we're talking about Net Zero Teesside, has never ever been even done at a commercial level before. But as I said, the upstream emissions are the ones which are really causing the issues on the carbon accounting not being done properly. And the UK gas supply at the moment is from UK North Sea gas, some from Norway, pipelined, and then imports of this liquefied natural gas, LNG, from around the world. And what we're seeing with new UK North Sea gas supplies going down, that LNG is going up, and the predictions are it will keep on going up. Now, as I mentioned, all the problems with LNG, and the calculations, what they call an emission factor, which goes in to work out what what the scale of these emissions are basically based on very old data. The data for the emission factors was put together in 2015. It's slightly sort of updated each year in tables from the government, but not sort of significantly. And it's shown to be much lower by recent satellite data. It just doesn't agree with the data we're getting from satellite data at all. And for example, in the North Sea, there's a paper showing even for the North Sea um, methane emissions, it's 5 times lower than it should be. Um, so what you've got is emission factors which are underestimated to start with, not based on real world data. And then they also don't account for increases in LNG, liquid natural gas, as UK supply declines and more LNG will be used. So you've got you've got a real underestimate. Um, and there's recent science on this. There's a paper called the Howarth paper, which basically showed that it calculated the emissions for LNG coming, for example, from Texas to the UK was one of the routes being modelled, other ones as well. And it basically said that if you're using LNG, gas power, then it's a third worse than burning coal. So the and another way of looking at it in the UK case is that 2/3 of the emissions of a gas-fired carbon capture plant are in these upstream emissions. So even if you were able to do 90% on the stuff you burn, you're only addressing 90% of 30%, because 2/3 of them you just can't capture anything. So that's the situation. Um, and the other aspect is, this is a technical aspect about methane um, impacting the climate over a 20-year period. All the impact of methane, atmospheric impact, is in the next 20 years if it's released into the atmosphere, because it has a half-life of about 10 years. So after 20 years, it's gone. But all the climate impact is in the next 20 years. But the emission is the methane emission, the impact is averaged out over 100 years effectively. So they're not actually picking up the near-term impacts, which are the really important impacts when we're trying to get to net zero and try to stabilize global temperature and so on. Just some recent data from a satellite. This satellite's only been up a few months, and it is monitoring methane. It can actually sort of go in at the resolution of, it can sort of look at an individual oil well, or there's one I saw where it showed methane leaking out of an LNG ship in a port. So it can get very high resolution. But if you look at these blobs over here, that's all southern Texas, things like the Permian Basin in Texas, where they're fracking gas. And frankly, the gas wells are, not much more than just open to the atmosphere. Once they've got once they've fracked the gas, open the atmosphere, methane leaking out. They're not being capped properly. Though, one of the things in Biden was trying to do was to enforce that more, I think. But you can just see the huge amount of methane there in that part of the world, and that's quite likely to be where methane coming for that liquid natural gas coming to the UK would come from. So I don't know how we're doing for time. I wanted to show a short animation which just sort of pulls that all together. It's 1 minute, and then move on.
You're okay on time. Show your thing, and then for some reason we still got 20 minutes. We can flow on for 5, 10 minutes if people want. It's a very popular subject, so don't mind going
Okay,
over.
if people are happy to run over, then I am.
Storage as a low carbon solution. However, carbon capture and storage is controversial because it locks in continued fossil fuel use, is unproven at scale, and has never achieved the claimed 90% capture rate.
Andrew, are we seeing this? Just checking. We're not seeing a video.
What are you seeing?
Climate impacts 1 minute animation, a green slide.
Oh, okay. Perhaps I need to stop.
Share the other screen, maybe, if it's playing on another.
Yeah, I did do that, but I'll share again.
Brilliant presentation. Thank you for all your hard work. It's amazing.
Oh.
Yeah, bingo. Got it. Back to the beginning.
However, carbon capture and storage is controversial because it locks in continued fossil fuel use, is unproven at scale.
Well, I was only showing a clip in the middle.
Oh, I see. Sorry.
Yeah, it's a 4 minute video. So Yeah, I'll just start it at that point again. Really, it was to show this LNG shipping and pull all that together.
Capture and storage is controversial because it locks in continued fossil fuel use, is unproven at scale, and has never achieved the claimed 90% capture rate. Despite this, the previous government included Net Zero Teesside in its energy plan. Net Zero Teesside claimed that after capturing 90% of the carbon from burning gas, the plant would emit around 6 million tonnes of CO2. This was misleadingly small, as it ignored significant upstream emissions. Methane in LNG is a dangerously potent greenhouse gas. Extracting, liquefying, transporting and regasifying LNG causes substantial methane leaks and consumes a lot of energy, leading to additional emissions. Carbon Tracker estimates the total emissions to be 20 to 40 million tonnes of carbon. Although these upstream methane emissions have the biggest climate impact, the companies did not initially declare them to the planning inspectors. After retired scientist Andrew Boswell.
Right, I'll see if I can get back to the other screen now. Do you see that? Were you still seeing the animation?
Video, very good video. Be good to post the link for people to watch the full thing.
Oh, okay, yeah, I will do that. Yeah, I'll restart the share. So hopefully you can see that.
Yep, we can
That's
see
shot,
some
right.
red
So
slides.
this was at the core of the legal case. I just want to sort of try and give a bit of an overview to the legal case and how difficult these things are really to challenge. That the oh, that's better. Yeah, the initial submission, as it said in the video, they were saying over 25 years, BP Equinor was saying, oh, it's going to be 6 million tons of CO2 from this thing. Basically, I had a long argument with them in the planning examination, got them to do a another submission where they had to include the upstream emissions, but they calculated them on the basis still of these really out of date emission factors, and I couldn't push them on that. It was just not possible to do that. But it then went up to, I mean, it actually shows it as 16 there, but it's actually 20 because that doesn't include the venting of the CO2, which is another 4 million tons. But that was the final submission, and that's what the legal case is based upon. But the legal case doesn't even look at when you look at the LNG. Now, these factors are calculated by Carbon Tracker, and they're actually calculated a few months after I started the legal case. But they just, this superb work, this from Lorenzo Sani. I don't know if he's on the call, but absolutely brilliant. He's worked out what these upstream emissions would be on different scenarios for different LNG. So LNG average is probably LNG coming from Qatar, but when you get LNG high, that's sort of fracked gas like that stuff in the Permian Basin. And you can just see how the emissions shoot off the graph here. And that's the problem we have, is that the government have got no control over what's coming into the UK. It's all just market forces and everything, and yet they're allowing these things. Well, they're trying to allow this thing to go ahead on this initially. So what I couldn't actually sort of say, well, you've got the carbon emissions wrong, because you can't do a legal challenge on that. The courts aren't interested in sort of deciding scientific things, but what happened, what you have to do is look at whether the decision making process was carried out completely lawfully, or whether there's some legal error in the decision making process. And what happened on this one was that Claire Coutinho eventually agreed that there was this 20.8 million tons. They basically agreed by my environmental impact assessment completely, rather than BP Equinor's one, which was much less. And they said this is a significant adverse effect on the climate. But then they said that Net Zero Teesside Power will help deliver the government's net zero commitment. Well, just from a common sense point of view, you would think that was rubbish. But there's actually a more legal reason to think that's rubbish too, which is that something called the IEMA guidance, which is the best practice guidance for doing EIA assessment, says that if you conclude that something is significant adverse effect, that means it's locking in emissions and it doesn't make a meaningful trajectory to net zero Teesside. So what happened in all the way through this planning examination, they were using the IEMA guidance. So, it looked like, well, they're just sort of inconsistent. They've said, oh, it helps with net zero, but then they've assessed the emissions as something which doesn't help with net zero. So that was the basic legal case. But then they came back and said, oh, well, really, we were using the national energy policy to say that there's a significant adverse effect. Well, now we're going to the Court of Appeal. We've brought in the Finch case to this. I've probably heard of the Sarah Finch Supreme Court case earlier in the year. It's the one on fossil fuels and saying that you have to account for the emissions upstream and downstream and so on with fossil fuel applications. Another thing it said was that national policy shouldn't dictate how you do the environmental impact assessment. So basically, what the Court of Appeal case is something along the lines of, well, either you used the IEMA guidance, in which case you didn't use it properly, and that's unlawful, or you did use this national policy statement, and in that case you're dictating how you did, you're letting national policy statements dictate how you do the EIA assessment, and that's also wrong as well. So that's basically the sort of legal, and you see it's a long way from the amounts of carbon emissions and so on, which we might think would be the more important points, but that's the legal case. And put out an invitation, do join me at the Royal Courts of Justice. I think everything's really building on CCS at the moment, and I expect that we will have a pavement protest. And hopefully a few more people than the one I showed in July. That was sort of relatively small. I think we had about sort of 10 or 15 then, but I'm hoping we will have a really good pavement protest on March the 4th. I don't know how much time I've got, but I just wanted to sort of whiz through a few other resources and what other people are doing and other things we could be going through going forward. I won't go into other issues. This is quite interesting because this is this NESO report, the Clean Power 2030 report, published last week. And this actually gave two different scenarios. So there's two different options. This is 2023, the power supply now, how it's broken up. It said we can either go for further flexible with renewables. That's things like long duration storage, more battery storage as well. Long duration storage is things like pumped hydro. And you really go for 50 gigawatts of offshore wind and all the solar and so on. Or we can have new dispatch, which if you look here, low carbon power, that is, whoops, I clicked it. That is, see that bit there, that black line is CCS. So that low carbon power would be gas CCS and blue hydrogen being used in gas turbines for power. So you see in this scenario, they've almost eliminated the CCS. What is interesting about this report is that they sort of saying, well, we can do it but with this further flex renewables option without much CCS. Then they say, oh, but we need CCS after 2030, which I haven't worked out why they're saying that. It seems to me to be totally illogical that if you can get to 2030 and get most of the electricity supply decarbonised, why would you suddenly then want to bring in more, carbon capture and lock in fossil fuels? But that's an argument to have. I think that's basically what I'm saying there. So this is the campaign. Perhaps we ought to stop here. I could just whiz through and sort of do 5 seconds on each one.
Yeah, let's whiz through, summarize that, and then we've got, we can go for another 15 plus minutes for.
Okay, that sounds good.
Running to far.
So the fun thing, basically, I'd say on this, whizzing through, read George Monbiot's Guardian article on this if you haven't. But this basically is saying when we give the subsidies, the government have said, this is a Tory thing, when we did the subsidies, we're not going to assess the projects for greenhouse gas emissions because the subsidy is only to construct them. It's not for the operation. So that's a sort of get out of jail free card they're trying on. The final investment decision, as I said, was meant to be September 24th. Maybe it needs full planning consent for net zero Teesside. Maybe it's being held up by the court. Peterhead, this is a very interesting example, similar one to the net zero Teesside, gas with CCS, except the EIA there has not included upstream emissions. And they're asking the Scottish government to redo the EIA. That's the ask. The Scottish government don't. I think that will be a very interesting situation. There's people protesting about Peterhead very recently outside the Scottish government. BP H2 Teesside, that's the follow-on blue hydrogen plant. This is just work I'm putting into the planning. It's a bit like the other graph I showed you. The only difference here is you'll see it's going up to 100 megatons, and that's because I've modeled the methane on 20 years rather than 100 in this example. So the methane modeling, the impact on the climate, is more scientifically accurate. BP Teesside, just say that's the planning examinations going on to 2025. The decision will be in August 2025 if Miliband sort of consents it immediately. They've got 6 months after the examination, but often there's a delay. It may go on for longer. MP Watch have done an excellent briefing. They're also working with MPs to help them do parliamentary questions, just to brief them on the issue, because at the moment they're getting a lot of sort of misinformation from the government. We've had climate scientist letters. In a minute, I'll put some resources into the chat, which have got most of these things in. The Climate Change Committee are about to publish their 7th carbon budget report. That endures for 5 years. We're still working on the 6th carbon budget report now. And so it's quite important we try to get more nuanced advice, at least from the Climate Change Committee on carbon capture. At the moment, the politicians get political cover from the Climate Change Committee because they say, the Climate Change Committee say we have to have some CCS. The Public Accounts Committee are going to look at it. That's a very influential committee in the House of Commons. They're looking at it in early December. That more beyond the value for money arguments. There's Energy Campaign Strategy Days, and I'd really want to put a plug for this one actually. This is where the energy justice and just transition and community side of opposing CCS can be really developed through the Energy Strategy Days. And get in contact on that. Put that one in your diary now if you want to get involved. That's in Leeds on February the 1st. We need to have a local campaign in Teesside, a Net Zero Teesside campaign. That hasn't developed at all. And that's it. Where do we go from here?
Andrew, that is absolutely incredible. Maximum respect for the incredible hard work you've been doing there. And we'll come to questions, just to say there's a reactions button down the bottom. You can raise your hand. just to say, I've been involved since '92 and seen about 8, 9 waves of these movements. And we were very involved with the anti-fracking movement, and watching your presentation there, very, very comprehensive, and seeing that different groups around the country are protesting. Maybe there's something as a movement we need to get more behind and support local areas that these things are going on. And all through the fracking campaigns, we just kept networking, kept blocking things up, kept setting up camps. And you never really think when you're in the middle of these things, setting up camps and making tea, that you think you're ever going to win. And eventually, through the nanas and the relentless activism, it did win. So this is, winnable as well if we all campaign together. So if you've got a question, a comment, a feedback, folks, there is hand raising down the bottom there in React. It's easier if you use that. The bottom of the screen, there's a React thing, and we can then see who is number 1, 2, and 3. Rob Palgrave, first off. We'll run till 10 past, folks. If you have to go, you have to go. But Rob, over your question, comment, or feedback.
Thank you very much, Andrew. My question, Andrew, is I've seen a comment that the issues with LNG shipments from abroad will be solved by installation of a pipeline from Norway to bring natural gas in. Is there any truth in this?
Not as far as I'm aware. Of course, it's possible that they will certainly ramp up Norwegian gas, but I think that a lot of countries in Europe want Norwegian gas as well, probably. So I think it's very unlikely. I mean, the other side of the equation is that there's a huge LNG supply industry building up. It's being overhyped, but there's massive amounts of LNG things going through planning and things in the States, to build terminals. So where's the stuff going to go if it's, I think it's unlikely, but interesting to see that if you could send it to me.
Yeah, I'll dig it out, Andrew. Thanks.
Over to Pete in sunny South Brent, Devon. Over.
Hello, Andrew.
Bye.
I was just wanting to ask you about the CCC. You mentioned that they support. They say that CCS is going to be needed, but I've been trying to work it out whether what they've been saying it's needed for. There's hard to abate industries like cement and stuff, and steel and stuff like that. But then there's hydrogen, and then there's gas power stations. Do the CCC say that carbon capture and storage is necessary to develop hydrogen and gas power stations? I thought they just said it was for hard to abate industries. Can you clarify that for me? Do you know yourself?
Yeah. Well, yeah, they do have CCS power in their models. So does the government in the net zero strategy. So if you look in the chapters in things like the 6 carbon budget on power and electricity, you will find some gas CCS going in there. And in fact, they also sort of say we shouldn't be running unabated gas in the future, which means they want to substitute it with gas CCS. But they largely work that out on the basis of not including upstream emissions. So yeah, no, they do have them in there. But one of the big problems is that the model they use for power, which comes out of the energy department, energy security and net zero department, is called dynamic dispatch model. And they it's a very complicated model, which is a black box. You can't see what they're putting in and what they're putting out of it, what outputs are getting from it. So you basically can't actually see what's inside it and what they're modeling. In fact, they're modeling lots of different scenarios, and then they take some sort of average and say that's sort of probably what we'll do. But it definitely does include gas CCS and blue hydrogen at the moment, and that's where we need, I think, to say, particularly actually with this report from NESO So they've put a scenario in where they're not including those. So it looks like they think it's possible to get the clean power without having gas CCS and blue hydrogen.
So just so I understand, the CCC are actually saying that we need carbon capture and storage for gas power stations and hydrogen as well as hard to abate.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
so. Yeah.
okay, got you.
Mm,
Thanks for that.
mm.
Okay, over to Anne Stewart next. We can tell who's on.
Hello.
Hello. Yeah, I'm just checking really. I'm just summarising that I've understood. The track 1 cluster, is the CCS being used for power generation and for hydrogen production? Is it being used for anything else? And is there any chance that they're using it for enhanced oil recovery? Do you know?
Yeah, they on the enhanced oil recovery, they are claiming they're not doing that, and they actually have some things in the documents saying, it can't be sort of connected to an active extraction site or something. But on the track 1, because there's the 2 clusters, and at Teesside, there's the gas CCS power station, there's the blue hydrogen one, and then there's a much smaller British Oxygen, well, no, sorry, not British Oxygen, it's BOC, um, existing hydrogen site, which they were going to retrofit with CCS under track 1. So that is, if you look at the amount there, it's less than 10% is adding it onto an existing industrial source. In HyNet, I'm not so sure, but I think in HyNet there's a waste energy for waste and incinerator, in other words, which may be in line to join the CCS network. And it's possible that they may bring in other industrial applications there. But in the track 1, it looks like most of the stuff is just, the fossil fuel based blue hydrogen and gas power.
And can I ask a second question?
Mm.
All the pipelines you were showing for actually taking the carbon dioxide out and burying it, presumably that all needs to be built and have planning permission for, or are they going to be using old pipe work as well?
No, that's new pipe, I believe. They've done it differently in the 2 clusters. The on the Teesside one, the carbon dioxide pipeline is part of the Net Zero Teesside power one. In the HyNet one, it's a completely separate application going through the shortly to go through the the planning inspectorate and the planning examination.
It's just interesting because the Fawley one, the reason it's withdrawn is they were obviously facing so many problems with trying to get the pipe work in.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, the CO2 pipelines are have various risks. I mean, there's the risk under the sea with the storage. There's actually been this case with a Norwegian one where the CO2 has been pumped into some cavern and it didn't actually escape to the surface, but it sort of moved underground somewhere else where it wasn't expected. So that sort of indicates there's a risk with the storage. But worse than that, there have been pipelines which have burst, and CO2 is a very, very dangerous asphyxiant. I can't quite say the word, but it's fatal. And very, very dangerous in that respect. So all the sort of health and safety issues on that need to be really looked at.
Thank you.
Okay, I think over to Jessica. Lovely to see you again, and thanks to all the MP watchers for the great article links and networking. So many people tonight. Jessica, over.
Yeah. Hi, Andrew.
Hi.
So just a couple of sort of smallish things. Well, first of all, completely shameless kind of ask. MP Watch has done a briefing with Andrew that you can find on our website. And even we'd love you to anyone here who doesn't have a group to start an MP Watch group. But even if you don't want to do that, please send the briefing to your MP. It's written in a very concise way to get the main points over. Unfortunately, it doesn't go into the details that Andrew's been going into today. We would need a second briefing in order to do that, but it does give the basics and would let them know, because I think some MPs just think, oh, it's part of the net zero project, it's a good thing, and this will alert them to some of the issues. Now, I'm not at all an expert, so I've been learning on the job working with Andrew. Now, Andrew, we know that 22 billion on paper is going to be put into carbon capture and storage through subsidies. There also seems to be in the GB energy bit of money potential for them to put even more money in through that. Now, there's one strand that's activated now. How many strands are there altogether that would make, because I think the 22 billion is over quite a long period of time, isn't it?
Yeah, this whole area is one. I was just talking to other people today about trying to really get a database of all these sort of questions which are coming up, actually. I mean, where, yeah, quick and simple, we can see all this stuff about what's in the various tracks, and how much is sort of new fossil fuel infrastructure, how much is genuine retrofit, so on and so on. In terms of the different tracks, on track one, it's very difficult to know what's going on. They put out last year, they had a sort of auction thing for track two, and that's when Peterhead and Acorn in Scotland and the Viking Humberside one sort of, they were told they were awarded track two status. But if you look at the government website, there's nothing else you can find about it. So, it's all hidden inside.
It's an emerging thing, and they know more than we know.
They know a lot more than us. I mean, we only hit upon the whole thing of Principle H by a sort of accident, really. I got, in a conversation, I got sort of pointed towards that and started to look at it, then realised we could actually send in this thing to the consultation, which we did, and we opened the whole thing up that way. But it was almost accidental that happened. And all this stuff about how the subsidies work, what all the different tracks mean, it's totally hidden. And it's only really by sort of working it out, reverse engineering it, and then trying to put it all together that we can get some idea of what might happen.
Yeah. So we haven't got anything like the transparency we were kind of hoping that we might get under a Labour government.
No.
Can you see any way that we might be able to put pressure on them to reveal that black box that you were talking about, where they make calculations? Is there any way you might that you can see you might be able to do that? Might your court case have a bearing on that?
No.
No.
No, it wouldn't have any impact on the court case. It's a future one might, and it's possible that if Friends of the Earth and Co., Friends of Earth, Client Earth, Good Law Project decided they wanted to challenge the next carbon budget delivery plan, which this government have got to do by May, that they could sort of say, look, you're not being transparent about the power sector now. How does this dynamic dispatch model work? And we could also try in other ways, I think, but
well, the great thing is Good Law is on it, aren't they? So they and Monbiot talked about that Principle H that you were talking about.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
They seem to be paying attention.
Yeah. yeah, I mean, people are on to Principle H, and things are happening. I not really sort of talk about too much, but we're looking at that whole area. Um, I mean, the whole subsidies thing is very difficult because it comes under competition law and everything. Um, I mean, I think one of the ways in also is to, I had, sort of trying to talk to the Climate Change Committee before they finalised the seventh carbon budget report and say, have you really looked at the science of this recently? And does what you were saying previously stack up? And I think this NESO report is interesting again because they're sort of coming out with, well, there is this other route. Interestingly, and it's a bit odd because they're owned by the Department for Energy and Security and Net Zero. And
Yeah,
whether that
it's
does make you wonder what's going on.
Okay. We've got one more. We've got another question there from Helen. No involved with DRAC stuff, and we'll maybe take one more comment after Helen or question if someone's got it, and then we're gonna probably wind it up. But if we'll stop recording, but if people want to continue debating and discussing or feedback, or if they've got to go for their tea, that's fine. But really, really interesting tonight. Obviously, a lot of 60 people turning up. So, how can we take this into steps? Just for Helen, just to bung in myself personally, being an activist, I like to see these things. What can we actually do? What are the next steps? Number one is support that court case on March the 4th. Number two, contacting your MP and MP Watch. Looks like they may have some resources there to help. Raising awareness through leaflets and sharing info. Share this webinar. And number four is action. If there's any actions we can actually do to raise awareness on this, it would be great. Get the media involved. Helen and one other.
Yeah, I sort of feel it's the carbon dioxide pipeline that might get local people involved, because there's been a couple of leaks in America, but I mean, they've got a lot of space. Our pipelines are going to be running very close to where people live, if not through their, actually underneath their towns, and that it's a dense gas, so it doesn't come up and disappear into the into the sky. It sort of lurks like low-lying mist. So it is a very dangerous gas.
Yeah.
I think someone just made a comment about there's a conference next week. Be good to let us know about that. And yeah, some of the, like Helen was just saying, some of these are the most dangerous, greenhouse gases, methane, and other ones are really affecting things. Deborah, I think hands up, University Challenge for the last comment, feedback question. Thank you very much, Deborah. And we'll come back to Andrew to sum up at the end and final comments. Over.
Right, thanks Phoenix, thanks Andrew. I just wanted to ask you, I mean, that was just fascinating. I didn't know anything was going on like this. I'm interested to know what the state of play is then with the Stanlow one, because I live overlooking the Mersey, and obviously that's going to be the one that's going to have the biggest effect here. So I wonder if you could speak on that.
Well, I can speak a little, Deborah. I'm not sort of a local, so I don't know if there's anybody here locally from the campaign who might, know more. But essentially, the hydrogen plant has got, as far as I understand it, it's got full planning permission for a small one, phase one, and then it's got outline planning permission for a second part. It is due to get the track one funding, but at the moment the carbon dioxide pipeline has yet to go through a planning examination. And there's also the hydrogen pipeline as well. So, it's by no means all there, but that's the same in Teesside as well. The stuff isn't all there. So I think we just have to keep fighting on all these things. And on the planning for that one, believe it or not, a huge industrial site blue hydrogen plant went through the local council, and it should never have done that. Because the Planning Act 2008 was set up to have this national planning regime which deals with all these big things, but they didn't update it for blue hydrogen plants. So it's got through sort of technically, lawfully, but it should never have gone through the local council planning. So yeah, there's lots of things we're looking at on that. Is anybody here from Hynot who could help on that?
No, but I'm based in the northwest. It's
Oh,
Marge,
hi, Marge.
Andrew.
Hiya.
Hi. And there is a lot of information on Cadent's website. I put the link in the chat earlier on, and there is actually a consultation on the HyNet hydrogen pipeline that's going on right now. It closes on the 19th of November. And you'll see quite a bit of information on that website. I mean, there's also some recordings of some webinars that they did over the last couple of weeks, so you'd be able to look at those as well. So,
Right.
yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I got the link for the consultation. Thanks very much for that. And yeah, I'll definitely be looking into it more and circulating that to my few contacts. Thank you.
Do you know if Hynot are doing a consultation response on that? Because it would seem to we ought to feed in stuff to Hynet if possible. I know that Hynot, there's now evidence that the hydrogen leakage from pipes and things is much higher than thought as well, and that's another indirect greenhouse gas. Actually, it's not something I mentioned earlier, but we're only just beginning to sort of get some more of the sort of on the ground evidence on hydrogen leakage and the climate impacts of it. I think that's quite relevant to the hydrogen pipeline.
Have you got any links to any evidence there, Andrew? Because I'd be happy to put something in my response to the consultation.
I'll send you over. I'll send you over what I put into Hydrogen Teesside recently, the H2 Teesside thing.
Super, that'd be great.
I put some stuff with this. There was a paper which showed that it's actually on a green hydrogen site, not a blue one, but it showed that the hydrogen leakage was, I think, was it 5 times higher than they thought, or it was certainly much higher than they thought. And saying it was getting to the level where it could again be a serious climate impact if hydrogen's rolled out in a big way.
It is absolutely bonkers. I mean, actually, Trafford has a green hydrogen plant at Carrington, which is where I am. And HyNet, as you know, are putting blue hydrogen in a pipeline. And where's the end of the pipeline? Carrington. So the blue hydrogen doesn't talk to the green hydrogen at the moment. So we're going to have a pipeline going over peat moss to a place where we've got green hydrogen, which is just absolutely ridiculous. So anyway, and my view is that there should be a lot more emphasis put on natural carbon capture solutions, such as restoring our peat mosses, which is so much cheaper. It wouldn't cost £22 billion to restore all the peat mosses in the UK, to be honest.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Can I just come in and say I'm actually in a group with Andrew that's looking at sort of trying to look at all the technical stuff. I'm not one of the best ones, but there's 1 or 2 clever people in it. And I was trying to share the Yorkshire and Humber Northeast Action on East Coast WhatsApp group. But I can't do it because I'm not an admin. can you do that, Andrew? Can you put it in the chat for anyone who wants to sort of
Yes.
get into the technicalities?
Yeah,
the one with Ellen.
Which group is that? The Yorkshire one, is that?
Yeah, let me just find it. Yorkshire, Humber and North East Action on.
I know that one,
CCS.
yeah. And you want the info on the hydrogen?
Yeah, I'm just thinking if there's anyone who's quite into working on stuff like this.
Yeah, I can put what I've got into that group.
Yeah, but can you put a link to that group in here? If not, I'll ask people to.
Oh, sorry, I see. Sorry, misunderstood. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can
you put a link into the chat? Because I can't see one. I presume because I'm not an admin.
Okay.
Yeah, give me a moment. See if I can.
And the other one, Andrew, if you can link that YouTube that you played, I think somebody requested.
Oh yes.
So, just to say before we come over to Andrew for final comments, thank you very much, Andrew. Absolutely dedicated, incredible work there, very deep work. I know myself from taking the UK government to court on illegal wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It takes a lot to take big corporations and big things to court. And, you know, there's a massive amount of work you've been doing there, and all power to you. Any way we can help as a movements to magnify that message. Having watched that, it's so much deeper than you know, only glimpsed the surface. It did remind me of some of the anti-fracking movement stuff, and we have to raise awareness about what's going on here and set up, you know, link. Link MP Watch. Sounds like there's great stuff ready. So just to say, folks, we're going to come over to Andrew for final summary, sum up, and then we'll stop the recording. If you do want to stay around a little bit and have a chat to it, you can. If you've got any more. So thank you very much, Andrew. Big respect. Over to Andrew for final comments and feedback in the end.
Well, I think the only final comment I've got really is thank you for all being here, and thank you, Phoenix, and the Climate Emergency Centre Network for hosting these. Yeah, do follow up the links and join local groups, join national groups, and so on. We're going to hear a lot more about CCS going forward. I mean, it's really interesting. The Tories sort of kept it under the cover, really. They did a lot of the work on this for the last 4 or 5 years. And then suddenly Labour decided to make it a really big thing. And I think it's not gone well for them so far. And I think we've got everything to play for with this. So there's a really big campaign building, and let's stop it, basically. Let's stop it. And I know there's people here from Drax as well. Let's stop CCS at Drax and the subsidies for Drax too. I'm sorry I didn't talk much about Drax, but you know, people from Drax know that I'm committed to that one as well. So yeah, thank you for being here. And it'd be nice to have a bit of an informal chat afterwards as well. Anybody who wants to stay.
Will do. Let's get behind this. We can stop this. There ain't no power like the power of the people, because the power of the people don't stop. We'll stop there. Keep networking for everyone. Thank you, Andrew.
Right. Thanks,